A fateful encounter. "Oh, hey," Tucker announced with a big, dumb grin spread across his freckled face. "That place with the pretzel dogs is open again." He speedwalked across the linoleum floor, bypassing crowds, and parked himself at the back of a line of a half-dozen people, waiting for his turn to order from one of the many food stands located within the local mall. He was 14, though his height of over 6 feet made him look older, but despite that, he beamed with childlike excitement. Across the wide mall corridor, Sarah let out an exasperated sigh, before following reluctantly after Tucker. As she did, she never once looked up from the smartphone in her hand, tapping it occasionally. By the time she arrived, Tucker had already reached the counter and placed his order for 2 of the stand's signature soft pretzel-wrapped hot dogs. His enthusiasm barely faltered when he was reminded by the cashier that food costs money, and that he didn't have any, before Sarah stepped up to his side and handed over some of her allowance money for the month. She did so with a roll of her eyes, but she still did it. Situations like this were pretty common when Tucker was around, and all of his closest friends had gotten used to it. Still, this particular instance was a little more annoying than usual, since Sarah hadn't exactly planned to hang out with Tucker today. The two of them had come to the mall separately to walk around and had bumped into each other soon after arrival. Without even talking about it, they'd just kind of fallen in step together. Sarah pushed her bouncy, curly blonde hair back over her shoulder while Tucker took possession of his order. When he handed one of them to Sarah, she wasn't surprised and accepted it without question. Just as it had been expected that Sarah would pay for Tucker, it was expected that she would share it with him. It was something that he and Sarah's sister, Tucker's best friend Jo, had always done since their friendship had begun, which had eventually been picked up by the rest of their friend group, the original 4 Dueling Hearts. Sarah even put her phone away to make eating the pretzel dog easier, and without it to distract her, she and Tucker started talking. He did most of the work, rambling about whatever popped into his head, switching topics without warning. But Sarah did participate, giving curt, monotonous responses. As disinterested as she appeared, though, a keen observer might have noticed the faintest hint of a smile across Sarah's face periodically the longer Tucker spoke. As much as she pretended not to be a lot of the time, Sarah was Tucker's friend. She liked his company, and she found his mad ramblings endearing, and even kinda cute. In fact, she was only really distracted from Tucker's info dumping very briefly when she saw someone else that she recognized. She flinched at first when she saw him, standing there, looking away from her and Tucker, wearing his beat-up hoodie with the hood up, his hands in his pockets. Sarah had to remind herself that this person, Max, wasn't her enemy anymore, and that he had promised to be around, so it made sense for him to be here. So, rather than get annoyed over his presence, she made note of the baseball cap he was looking at, smiled at how normal that was, and then turned her attention back to Tucker. The two fighters wandered around the large building together for another 15 or so minutes. They didn't go anywhere or do anything in particular, and before long they were even contemplating leaving and going somewhere else. Neither of them had eaten a proper meal since the morning. No, the hot dogs didn't count. And it wasn't like Tucker could pay for his own lunch out. "All right," Tucker announced once they had settled on a place. "I just want to stop in at that electronics store by the arcade. They were putting this really cool stereo set out last time I was there. I want to get a good look at the whole thing." "That's on the entire other end of the building, where we just were 20 minutes ago," Sarah protested. But it was no use. Tucker was already off and out of earshot. She rolled her eyes and yelled after him, "Fine, but I'm not buying you a stereo, so don't ask." By the time they neared the electronics store, which was one of the large department stores situated at the ends of the wide complex, they were walking side by side again. Sarah had pulled her phone back out and was tapping away. Tucker was smiling with anticipation as they approached. Then the two of them stopped suddenly, any semblance of excitement fading from their expressions, when an explosion went off inside their destination. "Oh good," Sarah said. "Now this is happening." Around her, mall patrons screamed and shuffled away from the electronics store chaotically. Sarah didn't react, though. She could sense the presence of soul in the air, and with all soul-related threats that she had been faced with recently, another one barely faced her. Tucker did react, but rather than run away from the explosion, he ran toward it. He also sensed that the explosion had been made by soul, and he didn't intend to allow anyone to be hurt by another explosion of that type, if he could help it. At first, Sarah was surprised by Tucker's quick action, but once she realized what he was doing, she smiled and ran after him. The two of them had barely passed through the entrance to the store when they were nearly overrun by dozens of patrons and employees fleeing the destruction. Behind the fleeing figures, flames reached up from the ground nearly all the way to the high ceiling. Below the flames, Sarah could see pieces of that ceiling burning, and above the flames she could see a hole leading to the second floor. She deduced instantly that the explosion had happened up there, causing a partial collapse. Tucker, meanwhile, didn't bother deducing anything. While Sarah thought, he acted, sending his soul out into the environment, raising his hands and then lowering them. The flames bent to his will, extinguishing themselves, revealing a young woman pinned beneath the falling ceiling pieces. In less than the blink of an eye, Sarah was at the woman's side, lifting the heavy debris off of her. Her first instinct was to lift the woman up and move her, but remembering some of the things that her mother had told her about back injuries, she waited until the woman had confirmed that she could feel and move her feet and legs. Even once she had, though, Sarah still picked the woman up gingerly. It was almost a comical sight, seeing someone as small as Sarah sweep a grown woman into her arms. Moments later, though, things turned deadly serious again when a burly man in a tactical vest, carrying a semi-automatic rifle, came down the stairs from the upper floor, caught sight of Sarah, and took aim. He discharged his weapon before Sarah even realized what was happening. Once again, it was Tucker who took action before Sarah. This time, though, that action saved Sarah's life when he placed himself between her and the shooter. Soul crackled along his entire body, and he snatched the hailstorm of bullets out of the air one after another until the shooter had exhausted his clip. The shooter stared on in awe as Sarah retreated out of the store with the injured woman, and Tucker surged forward, faster than the eye could see, and took the shooter down with a single punch to the gut. He caught the man's weapon out of the air when the man dropped it, pumping his fiery soul into it, reducing it to molten slag. Outside the store, Sarah found a spot off to the side, behind cover, to set the injured woman down. She thanked Sarah profusely, but Sarah ignored her, wandering back to the entrance of the store and looking inside in time to see Tucker scale the stairs and scan the upper floor with his gaze. She heard yelling, but she couldn't make out what was being said. Luckily, she didn't have to wonder for long. Tucker made his way back down the stairs a moment later, rushing over to her side. "There are more bad guys up there," he explained. "They blasted the floor out to stop the people upstairs from getting away, and now they're holding them hostage." "Any idea how many of them there are?" Sarah asked. "No," Tucker replied, clenching and unclenching his fists. "I couldn't see them, and I couldn't tell the hostages from the hostage takers with my sixth sense." Sarah looked into the store again. She closed her eyes and focused her energies, mixing the soul within her with the life energy at the core of her being, generating more of each. She sent that extra soul out in waves, like a sonar pulse that would bounce off of other instances of soul and nothing else. With that wave of soul, Sarah was able to perceive 17 sources of soul still in the electronics store. Only 3 of them felt particularly powerful, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. The shooter hadn't been strong in terms of soul, so it was possible that his accomplices weren't either. For a moment, Sarah felt defeated. A wave of anxiety washed over her, banished a moment later when she came to a realization about the scene that she had just witnessed in her mind's eye. She sent out another sonar pulse of soul. Sure enough, she was right. The 3 that had stood out to her were standing away from the rest, who were all crowded together. Sarah poised to re-enter the store, gesturing for Tucker to follow. Now that she knew where the hostage takers were, and now that she was sure that Tucker would be able to distinguish them as well once she explained things, she was sure that they could, at the very least, put themselves between the hostages and the hostage takers long enough for the hostages to get away. Sarah was so focused and intense that she nearly tripped when a masculine voice called out from behind them, "Hey, stop!" Sarah and Tucker turned together to face the source of the voice. They saw a middle-aged man with a receding hairline crouching down beside the injured woman to check that she was all right. Once he had, he stood back up and faced the 2 Dueling Hearts, revealing that, despite his age, he didn't look like a pushover. He was tall and fit, and carried himself like someone who was more comfortable in situations like this one than he would have preferred. "What are you kids doing here?" the man asked, "and what were you about to do?" "We're here saving people," Sarah replied, her tone making it clear just how much of a waste of time she considered this conversation to be. "And we were about to run up those stairs and save more. Who are you to stop us?" The man approached them, pulling a gleaming golden badge out of his pocket, showing it to the young fighters as he introduced himself. "I'm Lieutenant Thompson from the Checker Township PD, Soul SWAT Division. I deal with this kind of thing all the time. I'm off duty today," he explained, "but I called my co-workers back at the department as soon as the explosion went off." He showed them his cell phone to prove his point. "They texted me just a couple minutes ago that the robbers have contacted the department demanding to speak to a negotiator. He's on his way here right now with the rest of Soul SWAT to mop this up." He looked Sarah and Tucker over again, almost like he was struggling to place their faces, and said, "I appreciate that you want to help, but going in there would be reckless. Leave this to the professionals, or you'll just get yourselves killed." "We've already been in there once," Sarah protested. "That lady over there," she gestured toward the injured woman, "would still be trapped under the ceiling, and the place would still be on fire if not for us. Not to mention," Tucker added, pointing to the stairs, "that guy over there would still be up and waving around a machine gun if I hadn't knocked him out." Thompson looked past the 2 Dueling Hearts at the fallen shooter, then looked back over them for a third time as if he were seeing them again for the first. He looked back over his shoulder at the injured woman, his gaze begging for confirmation. She nodded, and Thompson's disposition changed. "Okay," he told the Dueling Hearts, "you guys are tough. I actually think I recognize you now, too. You're local soul fighters, right? With Team Double Hearts or something like that." "Team Dueling Hearts," Tucker corrected. Right, Thompson agreed, and that's great, and thank you for doing what you did, but you weren't trained for this kind of thing. Maybe not, Sarah argued, but we've already identified that there are only 3 baddies left. We even have the ability to tell where they are without even seeing them. We can take them down right now. She glanced back over her shoulder at the giant hole in the store ceiling. One of those guys blasted out the floor. Are you sure the entire thing won't collapse before your pals get here? Thompson looked past them, at the damage to the store, and thought about what Sarah was saying. After 3 long seconds, he gave her a look so serious that even she almost backed down. I shouldn't be doing this, he explained, talking quietly enough that only Tucker and Sarah could hear. And I wouldn't be if I didn't know from watching your fight just how tough you guys are, or if there weren't somewhere around a dozen hostages up there who might die at any second. And you can't tell anyone about any of this, but I guess I'm deputizing you two. He shook his head, almost like he couldn't believe what he was saying. Go, take those guys down, but be careful, and get back out of there as soon as you can, or if things get too rough. I'll stay back here and make sure none of them get away. Sarah wasn't sure why Thompson had decided to trust her and Tucker. She couldn't know that he was skilled enough at his craft to deduce from the scene before him how effectively Tucker and Sarah had already worked together to accomplish all that they had. She couldn't know that, even though he himself wasn't very skilled with soul, he knew enough about it that he could sense the gap between the 2 dueling hearts and the villains waiting above them. She didn't care, though, why he trusted them. All she cared about was saving as many people as she could. She didn't even think about it. It was just where her head had been since the moment she had seen the pinned woman, and she knew that Tucker shared that headspace with her. Thanks, Tucker told the off-duty officer, and he and Sarah turned together and rushed into the store as they had before. They paused at the base of the stairs, Tucker saying, I'll take the 2 closest to us. You head for the one in the back. No way I'm letting you have 2 of them, Sarah grumbled. You're faster than I am when my aura's down, Tucker countered. You can get to the 3rd guy before he realizes what's happening. He waited for Sarah to either agree or disagree, and when she found that she, surprisingly, couldn't fault his logic, she nodded, and the 2 of them launched themselves up the stairs at maximum speed without another word. Tucker didn't waste any time. He confirmed with his eyes what his 6th sense was showing him, locating the first of his 2 targets. It was, to his surprise, a young woman with red hair a little lighter than his own, wearing a vest similar to the shooter on the stairs, carrying an identical weapon. Surprised as he was, he didn't hesitate to do what he had to do, driving a knee into the woman's stomach, grabbing her, and turning in place, lobbing her across the room at the next closest to the robbers. This next target, a young man of around 19 or 20, was as tall as Tucker, with a shaved head and equipment that matched that of his allies. Tucker had hoped to catch him off guard, but his reaction times were much better than either of the robbers that Tucker had faced yet. He saw the makeshift attack coming, and he was actually able to do something about it. With time to spare, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Soul lanced out from them, creating a spark in the air that expanded into a powerful explosion. It knocked the young woman to the side, assuring that she was, at the very least, unconscious. But it also blasted Tucker back, sending him through several glass displays filled with expensive-looking cameras that he hoped he wouldn't have to pay for. Meanwhile, Sarah rushed past to this exchange, her sights locked onto the final robber, a man older than the others at around 25. Despite being equipped like the others, he gave off an air of being the one in charge. He exuded authority, and Sarah's 6th sense told her that he was, by far, the strongest of the villains present. She didn't waste any time, mixing her soul and her life energy together in motion, sending soul out throughout her entire body, strengthening her muscles and shoring up her durability. She came in low, her arms held close to her body, turned on her heel to build up some extra momentum, and then drove her tiny little fist upward toward the back of her opponent's head. Considering how quickly Sarah had approached him, and that she'd done so in his blind spot, she was surprised when he ducked out of the way, turned in place, brought his weapon to bear, and fired. Sarah reacted before she was even entirely sure what was happening, dancing around the flurry of bullets long enough to counterattack. As she moved, she sent her soul out past her body. The air around her grew heavy with moisture as any water vapor present in the air, along with the sweat dripping from the anxious hostages, huddled in the center of the room, was drawn to her. It condensed down, becoming liquid whip that Sarah held in her hand, lashing out with it, disarming her opponent and waterlogging his weapon. With a thought, that water froze and expanded, breaking the rifle apart at its seams. Sarah glanced around to make sure that none of the stray bullets had hit any of the civilians, and she renewed her attack. She had used up her water whip destroying his weapon, and so resorted to hand-to-hand combat, getting in close, dancing nimbly around him, aiming to get inside his guard. Her opponent wasn't unskilled, and he was pretty fast, keeping up with Sarah pretty well. Speed wasn't everything, though, and while he counterattacked with everything he had, his blows were weak enough for Sarah to divert them one after another with nothing but a single finger. This left her offhand open to deliver a powerful left hook to his jaw, sending him crashing through a sales counter several yards away. Back by the stairs, Tucker picked himself back up, mindful of the many small cuts covering his exposed skin. He focused his soul, and any shards of glass still clinging to him or his clothes heated up so quickly that they were vaporized. In the time that it took him to do this, though, his foe had raised his weapon and pointed at the crowd of hostages. "Back off, man, or I'll wipe 'em out. I swear to God." "You won't," Tucker replied, and in an instant he was right in the bald guy's face, his hand wrapped firmly around the barrel of the rifle. He wrenched it upward, pointing the muzzle at the ceiling, and superheated the palm of his hand, melting this weapon just as he had the last. "Shit!" the bald robber exclaimed, jumping back and away from Tucker. He once again raised his hand and snapped his fingers in Tucker's direction, but this time Tucker was prepared. He did the same, creating an admittedly smaller explosion of his own. But his explosion was shaped such that it diverted his opponent's blast upward, creating a flash bright enough that the bald robber had to divert his gaze, leaving him wide open. Before the bald robber could recover, Tucker surged forward, stepping straight through the remnants of the blast. Smoke and flames clung to him as he bore down on his opponent, swinging wide, delivering a massive right hook to the young man's jaw. He spun in place a whole 2 times before collapsing unconscious at Tucker's feet. Without hesitating, Tucker turned to the hostages and said, "What the heck are you guys waiting for? Let's get out of here." As he filed the hostages back down the stairs, Sarah's heart-to-heart with the lead robber continued. To her surprise, her opponent managed to pick himself up, dusting himself off. "Oh man," he said, "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you just made the biggest mistake of your life. There's a reason I picked this place to go after. I knew if things went wrong, I'd have the advantage." With a prideful smile spread across his face, the final robber sent waves of his soul out into the store all around him. His shoulder-length black hair fluttered wildly upon waves of his own energy, while wires unraveled from within the various electronic devices throughout the building, stringing and coiling together rapidly into long tendrils that lashed out one or another at his much smaller opponent. Sarah danced around the reaching appendages without much effort, watching as the remnants of all of those gutted electronics were drawn toward her opponent, forming armor around his torso, arms, and legs. Electricity danced across his body as he drew back his right fist, and more electronics were drawn toward him, smashing into each other, piling up around the robber's right arm, bulking it up to more than 10 times its original size. Despite the rigidity of the objects that made up his monstrous limb, the final robber was able to control their shape freely enough that he could still flex the arm normally. He used its reach to put Sarah off balance, and then he gestured one more time, and his wiry tendrils all lashed out at once, grabbing Sarah by her arms and legs and stringing her up. It was entirely Sarah's mistake. She had allowed herself to get overconfident, and she hadn't seen this restraint technique coming. She could send some of her water to pool between her arms and legs and the wires that held them, then will the water to expand, loosening the wire's grip, but she just didn't have time. Her opponent had followed up the grapple by coiling many cords together to make a pointed tendril that he thrust at Sarah's chest, intending to impale her, and she didn't have time to avoid the hit. Fortunately for Sarah, that's when a dozen or so knives spun toward the wires that restrained her, severing them, while a final spiraled past her and smashed into her opponent's would-be spear, fraying it messily and knocking it back. Sarah dropped to the floor, just as her frustrated opponent swung his giant fist at her instead. Seeing this, Sarah summoned her water to her right hand, where it condensed down into a set of icy brass knuckles. Sarah mixed her energies one last time, shunting the newly generated soul into her legs and her right arm, and she launched herself forward like a rocket. She met her opponent's punch with one of her own, shattering his giant arm, and then danced nimbly through the debris to deliver a spinning kick to the side of his head. He was sent sprawled out upon the ground, unconscious. Sarah looked around, confirming that Tucker had gotten the hostages, and both of his opponents, out safely. Then she turned and, reluctantly, she picked the final robber up and slung him over her shoulder, expending the rest of the soul that she'd accumulated to drop safely through the hole in the floor, and then dart out of the store completely. Nearby, Thompson was reassuring the hostages. In the distance, Sarah could see a group of fully equipped Soul SWAT officers bearing down on the store entrance. There was a crash behind her as she set her opponent down next to his companions. When she looked, she wasn't surprised to see that the ceiling had collapsed just as she had suspected that it might. Sarah and Tucker shared a look that said, "We should get out of here before we somehow get blamed for that." Without a word, the two of them slipped away, out of the nearby exit to the mall's back parking lot. It took a while, but Soul SWAT eventually cleared out, leaving only the off-duty Lieutenant Thompson behind. He stood out in front of the building, watching the last of his co-workers pull away in a reinforced truck, the 4 robbers cuffed in its back section, before turning around knowingly to find Tucker and Sarah waiting to talk to him one last time. "You did good, kids," he told them. "Thanks to you, everyone made it out of the store alive. There were injuries, but they were a lot less severe than they could have been if the floor had collapsed with the hostages still inside." "Yeah," Sarah told him smugly. "Imagine that." "Hey, don't get snippy with me, young lady," Thompson countered. Sarah might have been annoyed if she weren't so impressed with his audacity. "Anyway," Thompson continued, "I figure that you two deserve a couple of details. Remember, you can't tell anyone about any of this, or you'll get all of us in loads of trouble, but I managed to pull a few strings and call in a few favors. The hostages will for sure talk about you guys, but my associates aren't going to try too hard to ID you. As for the robbers, he said, there's not much to say. They're all repeat offenders, professionals, guys who convinced themselves that Soul should be used for taking what you want. They chose to rob the electronics store because their boss, with his technology soul, thought it would give him an edge. They ambushed the store manager outside during a smoke break and forced him, at gunpoint, to let them have their pick of the cash and merchandise. But another employee caught on to what was happening. They panicked, leading to the hostage situation. You kids broke up. He sized the two Dueling Hearts up one final time and continued. Listen, you two did a good thing today, but you can't make a habit of this. These were very special circumstances. Most times, the best thing you can do to help out is to keep out of Soul SWAT's way. My Soul SWAT unit is made up of good people who use police department resources to fight a good fight. It's what they care about, and they're good at it. Promise me you'll remember that. The two Dueling Hearts nodded, saying in unison, We promise. Thomas had nodded back at them. Okay, good. He turned and started to walk away. But, hey, you kids aren't bad at this. If I ever find myself facing special circumstances like these again, I kinda hope you two are around. And if being pro-fighters doesn't work out for you, you just might have a bright future with the Soul SWAT, if you want it. The middle-aged police officer walked away, his hands planted casually in his pockets. Sarah and Tucker watched him go, taking a moment to let the incredible events of the day sink in. Then, once the older man had climbed inside a noisy old 1970s sedan and driven away, Tucker turned to Sarah and asked, So, where did we land on lunch? And a pretty good lunch it was, too, though it wasn't good enough to distract Sarah from something that she had been thinking about since her final clash with that final robber. He had had her dead to rights, more or less. While she likely could have kept fighting after being speared by his tendril, if it had hit her, she wouldn't have come out of the fight unscathed, and things could have gone even more wrong. She could have been seriously wounded, yet she hadn't been, having been saved at the last moment by those many knives of which she was all too familiar. So, as a way of thanking her savior, Sarah returned to the mall that evening after she and Tucker had parted ways, and she bought a particular ball cap from one of the stores near the pretzel dog stand. She took it to a wooded clearing near the mall, just past a broad 4-lane road. She didn't know where Max was living or how to find him, but he had been known to favor this place. Without a word, she hung the hat from a tree branch and then left, hoping that he would receive her thank you.